Trip 4. The time was 17:30 hours, as I inhaled another cone of salvia, and after finishing my smoke I placed the pipe onto the silver tray on the table for safety, laid back, and it was then that I felt it to begin to take effect. Again, I had the feeling that I had fallen out of a window, and I felt as if I was on the ground outside a block of flats full of unmarried mothers. I don't know how I knew their marital statuses, I just did, and although, this time it was not Hollingdian, for I was up the north of England, which was apparent, because of their broad Yorkshire accents. I did not belong to any of the mothers, but I did feel a vague connection. The mothers were panicking, and trying to convince me that I had fallen, and that I was paralyzed by the fall, but I knew they were stricken by fear, and at not knowing what to do caught up in the panic. I knew this was a hallucination, because I was at home in my bed, and because of this I began to laugh aloud at the ridiculousness of it all. After laughing, the experience began to fade, and I came to, and the time was 17:45 hours, and 15 minutes had passed, and I immediately sat up in my bed, and had another cone. Trip 5. As the effects of the salvia came on, I felt myself rotating, and as I did so, I felt like I was searching for a particular form that I could become. Although I was on my back, and rested in my bed, I was turning not horizontal or vertical, it was kind of a halfway house between the two, and I suppose that one could proclaim that it was of its own dimension. On the other hand, if one were a shaman, one could say that they had become an eagle, for I caught the sight of an open field, and the perspective of this field could only have been witnessed if I had the freedom of a predatory or a migratory bird. Then, I began flipping through different images of borders, and it seemed from my perspective that I was actually off of the ground, flying through the air and gliding. My mind was switching through different inanimate objects for me to become, and I felt like that I had now become a border of some kind, but it was just finding the correct fence, so I could stop and remain fixed. After that, I was transformed into a barbed wire fence, like the ones that can be seen in the countryside that are put there by the farmers to keep their livestock from wandering off and contained in their pastures. I was twisting, and at the same time, I could feel a gradual descent, and a knowing that I was approaching ground level, and as I did I was transformed into the fence that was stretched out in both directions upon a bank that was raised above, and separated two shallow valley-type fields on either side, and I felt like I had become as one with nature, i.e. I was the bank, the grass, the fence, and was consciously aware of my surroundings. However, I must add that I was not the sky, for this was separate from me, although it was in my visual perspective. It was because I was moving in this new dimension, and not fixed, that my mind was flipping through a series of possibilities for me to become. I suddenly became a crop of windbreakers, and again there was interconnectedness with the environment, like with the border above. Then, all of a sudden, I had the distinct feeling that I was a Ferris wheel, and I think again that it was down to my spin, for the wheel was now turning like a big wheel at a fairground, but I did not feel like I was on it. It seemed like I was the wheel itself, as I could feel myself spin. Next, out of the blue, the spin took on another angle, as I was searching once more, or flipping through different inanimate objects and borders. Suddenly, I seemed to find what it was that I had been looking for, as I became a wooden picket fence in a small Midwestern American village. It was the kind of fence that Tom Sawyer had to paint in the movie that was taken from Mark Twain's famous book. It had nothing to do with Tom Sawyer, just that the fence in a small town was the same. Anyway, Tom lived down south next to the Mississippi, I think. And I knew this was in the middle of America. Although I was only the fence, I had a feeling of knowing everyone that lived in the town, and there was a feeling of intense belonging, like a happy sheriff, or a priest would feel. It was a feeling of belonging to the community. The trip faded and another 15 minutes had passed. The time was now 6 p.m. hours. The story so far. I can see that when I am in these altered states, it is not that I believe what I am actually experiencing. It is more in the region of knowing, even if I am deluded into thinking that I had fallen. However, because I locked myself in my bedroom, and the key, although attainable, for it was in my trousers pocket on a table at the bottom of my bed, and that I was naked and in bed, it seems highly unlikely that I had got up, got dressed, unlocked my bedroom door, gone down my hallway, opened and exited my flat's front door, walked along the corridor, went down a double flight of stairs to call and enter the lift, then got out on the first or second floor and jumped out of the only available window in front of me. That would not kill me, because there is a porch roof on the foyer that juts out in front of the building, which is at the main entrance directly below the windows, so I would be seriously hurt if I fell onto it. Nevertheless, I wouldn't be in a critical condition, but it would leave me ending up in hospital in this current disposition. Somehow, I was transported back to the experiences that came with trips 2 and 4, all in the space of 15 to 20 minutes, which is approximately the duration of the effects of the salvia. The only other way out of my locked room is out my 8-story window. And if I had been in a state of somnambulism, and removed all the obstacles in the way to exit my window, at that height, I would not be alive, feeling exposed and vulnerable to the beckoning malicious crowd, for I would be nothing more than a non-conscious messy slosh on the pavement slabs below. So, because this is also unrealistic, I am left with a paradoxical situation, for even though I am sure that I am in the positions of trip 2 and 4, it is as I wrote, I had the feeling of knowing without a doubt, and that was without the aid of the crowd, that this situation was not really happening, and that it was really just the effects of the herb. Let's get back to the salvia, and the audio and visual hallucinations. When the voices of the mothers were taunting me by stating the obvious, and displaying their incompetence, that they could not give me any help, and I did not shout at their stupidity, and at the helplessness of their situation, I simply and instinctively saw them projecting their shadows. When they persisted, and because I was among and caught up in the intensity of the reality of the trip, I knew that it was not so, so I made a parody of the circumstances, and I ended up shattering the nightmare with my laughter and coming to. On the first trip, I probably assimilated my past encounters of being in the accident and emergency ward at the hospital, or anesthetized in a white hospital gown on a gurney awaiting, or returning from an operation, along with the daily residue of some recent books that I have read on parapsychology. This no doubt is what probably triggered the whole hysterical episode. On the following trips, I could assimilate the experience with the ones before, and I could shed light into the horrific illusion with my wisdom. This seems to be the logical assumption when one reflects upon trip 2 and trip 4, when I immediately went back into the altered state in trip 3 and 5. The terror had been laughed away, and the experiences were pleasant. Now, the picket fence was probably what I had read in a recent book, where a scientist was listening to a medium that relayed a message from his girlfriend's late mother to pass on to her. The message being an image of a farmhouse, and a fence that bordered it, along with a chicken in the backyard, was proof for the scientist that the medium was really in contact, or voluntary possessed by a spirit from the spirit world, because the girlfriend was not present at the sitting, so it would be unlikely that it was telepathy, or cold reading, as the scientist had no knowledge of the image himself. If it were an act of extrasensory perception, it would have been grander than, if it were an actual spirit. The girlfriend of the scientist confirmed the authenticity of the medium and spirit by relating it to a house that she had grown up in when she was a child with her late mother. The scientist is a holder of a PhD in psychology and other medical sciences, and was a former teacher at both Harvard and Yale, which he incidentally left behind for another teaching job in America's Midwest. So, put this together, and one can clearly see that the conscious fence experience in Trip 5 could have been a past memory recall of Tom Sawyer's Fence, and the accounts of that recently read paranormal book. The conscious washing line trip could have been my subconscious memories of my sister's washing line outside her place in Hollingdian. However, in between the first and second trip, I had read about how a girl thought that she was a ball of string, and a man had a transpersonal, or a cosmic conscious experience where he became his surroundings, and he expanded out and up into the universe, where he felt the interconnectedness of all of reality, including God, the Creator. My own representation of this could have been carried over to create the experience of when I was the conscious fence with the sense of belonging. One could go as far as to suggest that the feeling of belonging could be the boy's experience of expanding out and cosmically merging, or integrating with God and his creation. The string that the girl thought and wrote of, and the boy's cosmic conscious experience could have inspired the washing line, the paving slabs, posts and the perspective of the horizon. The bird experience and the borders could also have been sparked off by the boy's account, with perhaps some Native American shamanism thrown in for good measure. On the other hand, when the weather is willing, I often walk the South Downs Way in Sussex, which is an ancient pilgrim's path, and it extends over the hills from Eastbourne to Winchester. The part that I walk across is on high ground with valleys at either side of the path, and it has barbed wire fences separating the fields that the path crosses. Now, if one was to take these panoramic views and say mix them up in the unconscious mind with the world soul, or Gaia, one could end up with the border and nature dream states, for I was not interconnected to the whole universe, just nature looking out and up at the sky in much the same way that I would expect Gaia to see her sun come husband Uranus, heaven, or the sky above her. I have done some reading on the world soul, the Mandelbrot set, and chaos theory among others that suggest that we are one with the forces and workings of nature. They show images of land, coastlines and mountainous terrains that are sculptured by wind and sea erosion, which they compare to the tracks and debris that humans create at building sites. The alternate dimensional spin that I was experiencing, and the flipping through the different borderline perspectives, could be relative to the parallel universe theory that I had recently watched on television, and had also read in the past in popular science books and magazines. The superstring theory that I have been reading could have, along with the girl's ball of string, been the washing line too. One could postulate that it might also be culture that could influence the salvia dream experiences. For instance, if one was to have no understanding of the mind from a Western perspective, and say was a shamanic tribesman, one could see that all manner of interpretations could manifest from the trip, or the subconscious. Further, once these experiences were brought back from the altered state, it would create a snowball effect, and the culture could end up with an array of seemingly mystical experiences. Then, those mystical accounts would not only be the catalyst for ritual, folklore, or spiritual culture, but that same spiritual culture would end up influencing future altered states and preconceptions. For example, if one were dressed up in eagle feathers and painted in symbolic body art, while ritualistically role-playing and expecting to unify with the spirit of an eagle to find the much-needed hunt, the wish fulfillment and daily residue alone could dictate the experience of the whereabouts of the next hunt that followed. In addition, Walt Whitman, Richard Maurice Buck, or some New Age literature, or maybe even some pagan or Eastern pantheist philosophy probably influenced the boy who had the cosmic conscious experience. The girl that was the ball of string also accounts that she was transported to Mexico on 2 separate occasions, and that she saw some natives, although she hid from them, so as they would not discover her. She knew it was Mexico for she had been there in the past, and she recognized the type of landscape, and of course the indigenous tribesmen. She knew that salvia came from there, and that the natives use it for spiritual purposes and practices. She has probably read Carlos Castaneda's Anthropological Exploits with the Mexican Indian shaman in the teachings of Don Juan. The reason for assuming this is that she said that she was a writer and was using the salvia to gain inspiration. And then she had an encounter with an omniscient spiritual shadow that called itself salvia, and I could not help but see the correlation between her imagination and also Don Juan's mezcalito, who has been seen by many trippers that have eaten or used peyote. The shadow entity told her to ask, and the first time, she was so taken aback that she froze and felt feeble or small-minded. Whereas, on the second encounter with the mystical being, she asked what she originally sought, and that was how could she gather inspiration for her writing. The being quoted a quote from a book that she once read. In short, it told her to concentrate. She openly admitted that she meditates, which is an act of concentration, as well as connecting to her spiritual self, or nature. So it is plain to see the possible roots of her fantasy. If it were fantasy, of course. Trip 6. The time was 8 p.m. hours when I inhaled the salvia. Afterwards I lay down comfortably on my bed, and I was suddenly transported to Bristol Housing Estate in East Brighton. I felt as if I was walking waist deep in concrete. However, even though it looks and feels like concrete, like the slabs that one has at the front of a house, it felt and reacted as if it were mud, and at the same time an elastic material that was attached to my waist, for I was not wading through it. It was as though I was stretching it in different directions as I maneuvered. I was in the yard of a row of front gardens, and I was looking for a middle-aged woman to be helpful. I was looking down the gap in between the houses and waiting for the woman to appear. I could hear her voice beckoning me, but she was not in view, and I persisted on seeing her in the hope that she may come into sight down the alley, but she never did. The woman, without overgeneralizing too much, represented a mother archetype, like one would expect to find in a housing estate. I could hear her calling to me down the alleyway, at the side in between the houses, and I was searching at either end of the house and looking down the path, or alley at each side of it so as I could be helpful. I could hear the woman, but I did not see her, and now her voice had taken on a chorus effect like the Cockney in Trip 2. I kept searching for the woman, because I still wanted to be helpful. I then began to come around, and I immediately took some more salvia. I remember thinking to myself that I may not have enough time to finish the cone, because there was more than usual, and my lungs were full and I could almost immediately feel the effects of it rushing in. There did seem to be just enough time, as I consumed and ingested the salvia, and I was just about ready to administer some more, and so I hurriedly finished the cone and then laid back on the bed to immerse myself into the experience. Trip 7. I felt this time that I was in a similar situation as the last trip. It was as if I had been transported back to finish the hallucination, only this time I was in North Molescombe, about 3 miles north of my flat. I was walking around the estate, waist deep in a similar flexible concrete slab floor, and I moved about in it as I had before, and I was sure that I was being helpful again, but I was not really sure how, or why. I thought that my being waist high in the concrete, which was mud, come stretchy fabric, was somehow holding the houses up and keeping the pavement together. It is very difficult to explain, but I was feeling content at doing what I was doing. I could not see the woman, but this time I felt her presence with a kind of clairsentience, that she was about 5 feet 5, and was heavily built, like one of my friend's late mother. I thought to myself, hey, I cannot be standing here in just my boxer shorts, I must put some clothes on. So, I was somehow in both my flat, and also in Moleskine, as if I had bilocated. I began to walk about my bedroom, then I got dressed, and I remember that I struggled for some time trying to find one of my socks. In the end, I thought to myself, oh, sod it. I do not need it, for if I have my trousers on, I have no need to worry, for I am not exposing myself in any way. I remember that I could partially see my bedroom. It was as if there was a dim light as I made my way to my clothes and put them on. I was only partially aware of what I was actually doing, and I just went along with the dream script like a well-trained actor, caught up and improvising in the moment as the play ensued. I felt comfortable enough to be in both my flat and this other place together, and I did not feel exposed or in any danger whatsoever. I remember vaguely opening my bedroom door, however, I did not remember unlocking it, just being able to open it and travel beyond it. Next, I walked down the hallway and made my way into the sitting room, and I was feeling both mystified and amused at my being in Moleskine and in my living room simultaneously. I must have made my way back to my bed, although I do not recall it, and eventually I found myself just laying there under the blankets, and I thought that all that just happened did not really happen, it was all an illusion. I lay there for a few minutes trying to hold on to the dying moments of the trip, and I could sense my aura that surrounded my body. It is not unusual for me when in a state of deep meditation that I often feel the energy of my aura. I usually control and heighten my awareness as I slowly travel up and down my being, with my consciousness focusing on, say, the feet, and then move up and down my limbs and body through the meridians and chakras. I do this so that I can unblock any blockages in my aura on the inside and the outside of my energy fields. These fields can be objectified with the aid of Kirlian photography, and there is a book that I have and keep meaning to read called The Hands of Light, that goes into detail about the energy fields that surround our bodies. Basically, they explain the aura inside and outside of our bodies. When the trip faded, I found that I was in fact dressed and lying in bed, as if I was trying to conceal my movements. When I looked at my top, I noticed that I had put it on back to front and inside out. As for my socks, they were neatly rolled up in a ball and placed tidily on top of my freezer at the bottom of my bed at the opposite end to the table where I had left them hanging on my air before the trip began. Basically, I never fold my socks up in that way and place them in my drawer unless I have just washed them, so I had to smell the socks to see if they smelt of my own scent, or the wash and they smelt of me. So I put them in the washing bin. I was rather shocked that they were not washed and cleaned, so I unrolled some fresh new socks, put them on, put my shoes on, took off my shirt, and put it back on the right way. The bedroom door was locked just before I had started the trip of this, I am sure, because I remember feeling safe as I locked it. I distinctly remember that I put my keys in my shirt's pocket and draped them along with my trousers over the area that was at the end of my bed. However, when I checked the door, it was unlocked, and the keys were placed back into my trousers pocket. I checked the time, and it was 9 p.m. hours, A whole hour had passed since I first took the salvia, at the beginning of the 2 trips. This time, I definitely sleepwalked, and my back felt like it had been brutally kicked, and my legs felt grazed and bruised. I suppose it would be what it would feel like if I had waded waist-high in concrete that had a texture like mud and an elasticized fabric attached to it. I say definitely sleepwalked because I had purposely gone to all the trouble of locking the door so that no harm could befall me if I found myself unaware and sleepwalking. I remember thinking to myself, as I was hanging my cloths over the air, that I would leave my boxer shorts on, so I could feel comfortable, and not exposed in the Freudian sense, and then the precautions, and my worries were humorously breached as I unconsciously did what I had tried to prevent. I think that placing the keys back into my pocket, after unlocking the bedroom door, and leaving it closed, but unlocked, rolling my socks up, and placing them almost satirically at the other side of the room at the bottom of my bed, and then getting back into bed with the blankets placed over me, like when I had first laid down at the beginning of the 2 trips, was amazing. It is like some prankster had hold of me, and did everything within their power to laugh at me like I had been laughing at them in trips 2 and 4. Of course, I am only joking, but it clearly showed me that there are depths to the effects of salvia that I still do not understand. It is so much fun. Upon reflection, on yesterday's trips it might not be that strange after all. On the second trip, when I was desperately looking for the mother, I think that I have found a correlation, and it's not the mother archetype, or a mother complex. About 4 months ago, an old friend and I bumped into each other in my foyer one afternoon at my building's entrance. Apparently, he had come for an interview in one of the offices that are situated below my flat, and he said that his mother had recently died, and I told him that she was at peace on the other side, and that he should let her go and then carry on with his own life. He told me that he felt her presence around the house, and that he liked it, of which I replied that it was cruel to leave her trapped and living as a disorientated post-mortal spirit, and that he should try to gain her attention and help her cross over. He said that he wanted her as a comfort blanket. I replied that he should not be so selfish, and reminded him of the scene in Casper where the deceased mother's spirit of the girl tells her husband to let her go, or they will not see each other again. I went on to say that he must let his mother go mentally and emotionally, and grow spiritually, and that he should help her to make the crossing to the other side in the light, because, if he did not, that she would be trapped inside his house forever. I said that just like she helped him into this world, so it was his turn to help her on her way into the next world, and that she would truly thank him personally when his time came to eventually make the crossing, for she would be there waiting for him. On further thoughts on the matter, I could also connect the mother to the mother that appeared in the cartoon world of Tom and Jerry. The mother in that cartoon series never showed her head. She was always seen from the neck down cleaning, and I distinctly remember that this puzzled me as a child, and I would even at times try to egg the camera to go up a bit, so that I could see her head, or the woman's face. Of course, when I was a small child, I did not think that I was not looking through a porthole, but a drawing for this was not in my schemata. Today, I would postulate of why the cartoonist had not drawn a head and assumed that it was probably so that it was seen from a mouse, cat and perhaps even a small child's perspective. However, I had for a while found myself wanting to see the mother's face, but after a time, I forgot all about it until now. When I reflect on the concrete that felt like mud and a stretchy sheet sewn to my waist scenario, as I tried to peer up the alleyway that was at the side of the house. I was in the middle on the outside of the house. And although I was able to move and search in this manner, the sheet come concrete, come mud adjusted in an elastic stretching manner. So when I stopped searching for the mother, or should I say her voice, when I returned back to my original position, at the center of the house, the surface that I was waist deep in went back to normal as if it had not been stretched at all, hence the word elastic mud. Ironically, I had been thinking on whether or not to have a night's rest from my inner voyages, and take time out to visit my brother in Bristol Estate, which I may add is a semi-detached house, with a paving slab path at the front of it. It also has an alleyway leading up to the back entrance. And I usually see if my brother is in for just before the front door, which is at the end on the right side on the front of the building. There is a sitting room window that is in the middle, where one can clearly see into the house, because he usually has the curtains open. If my brother is not in clear view, I suspect that he is either in his bathroom, which is at the far left-hand corner of his house, opposite the kitchen behind his front room on the ground floor, or I assume that he is out the back of his house, either in his shed at the top of the garden, or working in his garden, either cutting the grass or removing the weeds. When my brother is working on his garden, when I get the chance, I offer to help. I usually help a number of people with their gardening, and I do it for the love of it, not for money, for it is self-gratifying enough to be of some help, or feel useful, and it's also therapeutic. The people I usually help are my sister, who cannot do it, because she has recently become a mother, my brother on occasions, because he loves interior decorating and even working on his car, but he doesn't care much for gardening. My current girlfriend Anita's mother, because the workload is too much for her and her partner, who is always up to his neck in trying to maintain his bookshop, and is too busy to do his gardening, and at the same time he openly admits he doesn't like it. Finally, my friend's late mother's garden, of which I mentioned above, although that was some time back, at approximately 15 years ago. Now, if one takes a look at this in hindsight, and in relation to the trip, it is easy to see that thinking of should I visit my brother had been the reason for my being in a similar situation and location in trip 6. The middle of the house, where his living room window is located, is where I was standing poised searching for the mother. One can only see, of course, if the curtains are open, and the curtains are in the middle when they are open, then when they are drawn they return back again. This could relate to the elasticized fabric that was attached to my waist on the trip in much the same manner as curtains are attached to the window frame. Further, the window shelf is waist high, and when one is sitting down and seeing visitors make their way to the front door, one sees them from the waist up. If they are in the living room and looking out of the living room window inside of the sitting room on the settee. The front door is to the right of the house, and that is where my brother would let people inside his house if they were visiting him, its polarity being the path leading around the back of the house, where one would go if my brother were out back in his shed or working hard on his garden. I must add that, if he is out back, that he has constructed a huge fence and garden gate that locks from the inside, and so one would have to get his attention by shouting out to him if one wishes to enter. The path at the front of the house was originally built on a hillside, so it is about waist high from the actual street to the front garden. Now, putting this together, one can clearly see that the three different perspectives to gain entry manifested into the trip, and that I was up to my waist in concrete mud come elasticized fabric, could be explained not just by the height of the windowsill, but by the different height from the actual street to the front of the garden and the curtain's flexibility. I did not mention, however, but I do think that it is relevant, is that if one walks across the path and comes to its end, then peers over the waist-high mesh fence, that there is a vertical drop about waist-high again onto the pavement below. The curtain's movements that swished back and forth from the sides to the middle with all that I have just referred to above put together in a surrealistic way. Of course, as I said, would explain the stretching and pulling of the concrete path, come muddy elasticized fabric around my waist that stretched to either side of the house boundaries on the trip. The mother's voice and the connection to my brother could be that my brother's wife went to work one day and did not come home and no one expected it. She callously left my brother to raise their 4 children on his own, and in order to do this properly, he had to give up his work. When we were kids living at home, my brother was always tidying or moving the bedroom around, and I, who did not really care about the state or look of the room, was always getting into trouble with him. Because he is 18 months older, and was often given authority by my mother to take me downtown to have my hair cut, is probably why he felt or thought that he had the right to tell me to keep the room tidy. I constantly moaned about this to my mother, and she, in order to save me some trouble, bought us each a duvet for our beds. Now, she thought I would not get stick from him at not making my bed anymore, because with the duvet, I could just flick it and it was made. Then there was his classic command that has been a joke all the way up through our teens and on into our adulthood, when he told me that I must not just flick the duvet and think that it was done, for I had to stretch and pull it to get rid of the creases, and he said I had to also get the daisies straight. My mother did not foresee this problem, but I am sure that if she did, she would have got a duvet without daisies or patterns printed on it. When my brother was looking after his own children as a single parent, they went through the same hell, for my brother is an obsessive-compulsive house cleaner, and this sometimes spills into one's world with his frustration attached when he feels that one does not reach his standards. I must state that he never hit or abused his children, and that they have all grown up to be healthy, well-balanced, responsible individuals. So, to put the first trip into perspective, it was a mixture of daily residue of me thinking that I should really visit my brother and all the above that made up the conscious dream. Now, what I have forgotten, but have now recalled, is that in trip 6 I was laughing in a satirical sense that I could not be in this mad situation that I had found myself in. I was laughing at being waist high in concrete slabs, and being beckoned to look around the corners of the house by the mother's voice. When I got back to the middle of the house and began traveling to my right to peer down the other side of the house, I began to think of my ex-friend Mike in this scenario, and this came into the dream because he had said earlier in the day, when I was trying to explain the effects of salvia, that he has done the same on LSD. And I said to him that it was not the same, that instead of seeing and feeling the hallucinations, one was involved in the experience like that of a conscious dream. In the past, Mike, my ex, her brother and I were invited to a local town called Worthing to go to a psychedelic intellectual spiritual party, and we had all taken a few trips to put us in the right mood for the occasion. Basically, when we got there we were completely high as we entered the party that was in an old mansion that had been converted into self-contained flatlets. As we entered the party, we were immediately led to a bucket bong, which was at a table in the kitchen, of which we all partook, that subsequently blew our minds, and we all began to have a bad trip. It didn't help that when the negative trip was on its ascendance, that we were led to a large window that looked out onto a main road. And we were showed the remnants of a recent accident, and were told that it happened because there was a large star shining bright above the road, and it became apparent that we had to leave the party for a couple of hours and get grounded in the countryside to de-escalate the bad trip. On our search for nirvana, Mike had completely broken down, and he had a full-on primal, as he started to cry and scream hysterically out aloud, and in full blast as he begged, pleaded and cried for his mother. We all did our best to calm and comfort him and tell him that he could control the trip. If we could get to the countryside and get away from the houses, traffic and local authorities' attention. He gained lucidity for a brief moment when my ex slapped his face, and he called out her name, but then he instantaneously went back into his primal state. After that, we walked towards the hills in seek of our salvation, and when we got there we all group hugged in an open field as we meditated. After a while the trip calmed down, and the experience transformed into a blissful and joyous occasion. So we went back to the party where we were warmly welcomed when we had explained our reason for leaving seemingly impolitely earlier. Back to the salvia trip in the garden. I couldn't help but think that, if Mike was in the same situation of how he would have reacted in reference to his past in relation to how he reacted on that trip, and I was certain that he wouldn't be so blasé, and this put me in hysterics, which brought me to and I awoke from the trip. There are, according to research, 7 levels to the effects of salvia, and level 5 is vivid conscious dreams, accompanied by hearing voices, and level 7 is unconsciousness, or somnambulism, and or sleepwalking. The lower levels are mild to not so mild hallucinations. So taking this into account, I think that in trip 7 I was oscillating between level 7 and level 6. The dream imagery was carried over from trip 6, which was the searching for the mother when I was originally trying to find my brother, who was the matriarchal monarch in his house. What is interesting is that I had purposely locked the bedroom door as I wrote above, and that I had managed to get dressed and undo the door like a sleepwalking Harry Houdini. Now, what is also interesting about locking the bedroom door was that, if I had got dressed, unlocked the door, walked down my communal hall, down a flight of stairs, then got into the lift, stopped on the first floor, and jumped out the window, that I would only end up on top of the foyer roof at the entrance to my building, and that no one would see me or hear me scream. It is funny that on trip 7 that I had completed at least half of that sequence, and had then, instead of exiting my flat, entered my living room, and at the same time had been projected mentally to North Molescombe, to my friend's house, to look for the mother, the same friend that I met a few months ago in the foyer at my building's entrance, who had lost his. I am lucky that I did not think of exiting the bedroom window, as if I was Superman, for if I had, I think the salvia experiments would have been cut off in their prime along with my life. Another little thing to conclude my roundups of trip 6 and 7 is that this morning when I awoke and got out of bed I found my original socks that I could only find just one of when I was in the somnambulistic state searching, and I found them in the washing bin. So, I probably mistook both of the socks for one sock and threw them both without knowing into the washing basket so they could be washed. After that, I must have walked down the other side of my bed and retrieved a fresh rolled up pair from my drawer, and then left them unrolled and placed them onto the top of my freezer at the opposite end of the room. Of course, to get to this position one has to walk around the bed, as I have heretofore explained. Upon reflection, it is self-evident that the salvia effect is probably a conscious dream state, which is comprised of daily residue, wish fulfillment, and past and present repressions, or traumas rising to the surface brought about because the mind is in an unconscious mind state when it first goes under that switches over to a theta dream state, like it does every morning in dream sleep when one wakes naturally in bed. My conclusion is the effect of the drugs intake produces hallucinations, and they were not the mystical experiences that I so feverishly sought. However, they could be metaphorical allegories that could perhaps, when scrutinized, reveal the right path for me to attain my enlightenment.
one thing,